after the judgment of the waters, when the roar of the flood ceased and the earth fell silent, the survivors descended from the ark with fear and hope. Noah, the righteous man, walked on a new, wet world, his gaze fixed on the sky. His 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, were the bearers of the future. Humanity had been reset, but the heart of man remained the same. From Ham came Cush, and from Cush came Nimrod, a name that would soon shake the earth. From his earliest years, Nimrod was unlike any other. He had an intense gaze, a voice that drew crowds, and an ambition that burned like fire in his veins. He wasn't a shepherd of flocks, nor a sower of fields. He chose another path: hunting. From a young age, Nimrod displayed extraordinary abilities. He was swift, lethal, and calculating. He glided through the trees like an invisible predator. With firm hands and a penetrating gaze, he faced the most ferocious beasts of the post-flood world. In a time when nature was still wild and dangerous, Nimrod became a legend. It was said that there was no beast he could not bring down, that his bow did not miss, and that the roars of lions were silenced by his mere presence. Having made a name for himself among men, Nimrod was no longer content to be seen as a mere hunter. His fame had grown, his presence commanded respect, and his ambition knew no bounds. In a time when humanity roamed freely, facing the dangers of wilderness and the constant threats of hungry beasts, Nimrod had an idea that would change everything. Why live isolated and vulnerable when they could organize? Why continue fighting the beasts when they could build walls, raise cities, and establish protection? And why not go further? Why not unite those cities under a single government? Why not build a kingdom and place yourself as king? With cunning, influence, and power, Nimrod became humanity's first great leader. He wasn't simply a talented hunter, as Genesis describes, but a man with vision, strategy, and a hunger for dominion. A leader who not only wanted to organize people, but also to unify the world under a single human government, independent of the Creator. Thus, he founded the first kingdom in biblical history, and with it, the first system of collective rebellion against God. The book of Genesis chapter 10, verse 10, states it firmly. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. This passage, although brief, contains a colossal truth. Politics, the city, the empire, and false religion all began in the same place and under the same figure, Nimrod. But Nimrod wasn't satisfied with that. His thirst for power was insatiable. After consolidating his rule in Shinar, he looked northward toward the Assyrian highlands, beyond the rivers. With arrogance in his heart and the banner of his empire waving in the wind, he assembled a colossal army, composed of thousands of men and numerous cavalry that made the ground tremble in their wake. Thousands of horses covered the valley like a wave, and each javelin thrower wore on his chest the emblem of his king, Nimrod, the Invincible. With power and violence, he swept across the Assyrian lands like a whirlwind. Villages were subdued without resistance, and towns fell in surrender before his presence. It was then that he built a new city, even further north, a fortress that would be his next bastion of control, Nineveh. He founded it as a testament to his conquest, like an added crown to his growing empire. Nineveh wasn't just a military city, it was also a declaration. Nimrod knew no bounds. He believed himself invincible, untouchable, a demigod among men. His word was law, his presence imposed fear, and his ambition seemed to know no bounds. In the training camps of Nineveh, his name was heard like a war cry, and the priests of their temples began to worship him as if he were an envoy from heaven. Nimrod's kingdom extended over the region we know today as Iraq, a land of ancient rivers and fertile valleys, called by the ancients Mesopotamia, meaning between rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. There, where the Garden of Eden perhaps once flourished, a system of spiritual arrogance now arose. Then, after consolidating his power as a great hunter and undisputed leader of the post-Diluvian tribes, Nimrod took one more step towards his true ambition, to build a world empire far from God. It wasn't just about gathering people under his name. It was about establishing an order, a system, a kingdom that didn't depend on heaven, but on earth. And to achieve this, he needed two fundamental pillars. First, a city. Not just any city, but an imposing capital, a strategic point of unity and government. A seat from which he could centralize power, establish laws, and extend his influence. Thus, he began to build the city of Babel in the fertile land of Shinar. But Nimrod knew that a city alone was not enough. If he wanted to conquer the souls of men, he needed more than walls and streets. He needed a symbol, a common point of reference, a monument that not only united peoples geographically, but also unified their emotions, their pride, their desire for greatness, and their rebellion against God. And so the vision of the Tower of Babel was born, a tower that would shout to the world that they could reach the highest point without divine help, a city that would bear witness to their reputation, their name, their glory. And so, a new civilization emerged, born from the alliance between men who shared a single language and a single purpose, to exalt man above God. Now, in order to carry out their ambitious plans to build the Great Tower, the men of the plain of Shinar faced an unexpected obstacle. That land lacked stone. Unlike other regions where the mountains offered solid rock, Shinar was a vast, fertile plain, but lacked the sturdy materials to build a colossal structure. For days they debated, searched for solutions, and dug in vain. But the decision to build the tower to the sky had already been made, and nothing, absolutely nothing, would stop them. It was then that Nimrod, the imposing leader, the hunter of men and founder of cities, proposed an alternative. Let us make bricks and bake them in the fire. Let us use them instead of stone, and let pitch be our mixture. And so, as if a primitive force had been awakened, multitudes of men set in motion like wild beasts obeying an order. They built giant ovens, fire chambers fueled by wood and reeds. Day and night, hardened hands molded the clay, pressed it into molds, dried it, and fired it. The bricks came out hot, hard, red like the earth itself, and each one was a declaration of rebellion against the sky. But bricks weren't enough. They needed tar. Another crowd then headed toward the natural wells where the ground breathed darkness. Bitumen, or natural asphalt, spread out onto the surface in thick, black pools like open veins in the earth. Using shovels, jugs, and ropes, men collected tons of it, hauled it back to the city, and used it to join brick to brick. It was sticky, tough, perfect for erecting a structure destined for eternity. The tower began to rise. There was no turning back. The city roared like a living organism. Smoke from the furnaces filled the sky. The scent of burning tar filled the air. And at the center of it all was Nimrod. He didn't fear judgment. He didn't seek divine approval. He watched the work with satisfaction. His face, hardened by the sun and power, reflected pride, dominance, absolute control. The days passed, and the tower continued to grow, brick by brick, beyond what the eyes could imagine. Some men died, falling, crushing, suffocating, but that didn't matter. They were silent sacrifices of a work that promised eternity. Those who remained continued building like wild beasts, driven by fervor, by collective ambition, by the command of the hunter who had become king. The heat was unbearable. The sun blazed from above and the furnaces from below, but everything was calculated. Women and children walked the dried mud streets with pitchers and jars, distributing water to thirsty men and washing the dust from their chapped mouths. And when mealtime arrived, the feasts were lavish. Cooked meats from sheep, goats, and oxen were served on long stone tables under makeshift awnings. The aroma of roasting meat filled the city, a reward for those who worked tirelessly, like beasts tamed by ambition. But when night fell, Babel changed its face. The silence of the sky was replaced by tribal music, drums and flutes. Torches were lit, cups were raised, and the name of their god, Marduk, was invoked. The tower wasn't just a feat of engineering, it was an offering to their new divinity. The parties were wild, the wine flowed, the revelry was complete. Men and women gave themselves over to lust under the shadow of the colossus that towered into the firmament. But after each night of celebration, the next day brought the relentless march of construction once again. The sound of the flutes faded with the first ray of sunlight, and the city awoke to dust, sweat, and glowing embers. The men, half drunk, half asleep, dragged themselves back to their posts. There was no compassion. There was no pause. The tower must keep growing. The heat of the sun and the ovens beat down mercilessly, but no one dared to protest. The project was bigger than their lives. Nimrod's vision had become a collective obsession, their eyes burning with fatigue and fanaticism. The men molded clay. They laid bricks and carried black tar that bubbled like dark blood gushing from the bowels of the earth. And the tower rose, tall, gigantic, defiant, from the fields, from the mountains, from other villages. Everyone could see it. It was said that she would reach heaven, that the gods would see her and bow down to her. The entire city believed that the name of Babel would be eternal, that nothing and no one could stop them, that, at last, man would be like God. And the higher the tower rose, the lower the fear of God sank. People no longer prayed. The Creator was no longer remembered. The only glory that mattered was that of man. Nimrod, from a raised platform, looked down on each brick as if it were a jewel. His eyes shone with the madness of someone who believes he has conquered heaven. And beneath his shadow, thousands labored as willing slaves to a corrupt cause, the exaltation of the human ego. But above, the sky was not silent. The eternal God, he who sees the heart of man, looked with profound gravity upon that structure that stood defiantly. It wasn't just a tower. It was the symbol of a humanity that no longer loved its creator. United by a single language, driven by a shared arrogance, men organized not to worship him, but to usurp his place. And then, God came down, and he said, "Behold, the people are one, and they all have one language, and they have begun the work, and nothing will be dislodged from what they have planned to do." The unity of men had given way to a dangerous ambition. The lack of language barriers allowed them to combine knowledge, build empires, and multiply their pride. Nothing seemed impossible to them. not because they sought good, but because their hearts were still corrupted, even after the flood. The judgment of the waters had cleansed the earth, but man's heart remained polluted, and now that pollution manifested itself as a global project of rebellion, a world united to resist God. And the Almighty could not ignore it, not out of fear, but out of love, because allowing humanity to advance in its limitless madness was leading it straight to the abyss. The human heart had already proven itself capable of violence, idolatry, and corruption, and now the entire earth, united under one voice, rised against heaven itself. It was an organized, strategic, and global rebellion. Then God spoke, "Let us go down and confuse their language, so that they will not understand each other's speech." And so, with a simple divine act, language, that invisible bridge that unites minds and hearts, was broken. The first crack was imperceptible. A supervisor gave an order, "Get the mix-up." But the loader looked at him confused, his eyes half closed, and responded with a series of guttural sounds. "Nakare volantash." The supervisor frowned. He thought he was playing, but the loader persisted, now angrily using even stranger words. On the other hand, "Pass me the chisel," shouted a worker. The other replied, "Tsorakli bem." "What?" said the first, confused. The second frowned. He thought they were insulting him. He repeated himself, now annoyed. The first backed away, and within seconds they were shouting, pointing, pushing. A few meters away, a young man was bringing water to his father, who was working at the top of the tower. "Dad," he shouted, holding out the pitcher, "Here you go." But his father answered him with words he had never heard before. "Sama Vilntor." The boy stopped. He looked at him confused. He spoke again, but the man just looked at him as if he were another child, one he'd never met. And then the boy cried, and the father, too. The women in the markets began to argue, "That's not what I asked for. You're robbing me. What are you saying? Speak clearly. Speak my language." The stalls overturned. Fruit rolled on the ground. A woman hit another with a basket. Screams, crying. No one understood anyone. Everything became noisy. Inside a house, a wife was cooking. Her husband came in and asked for their son. She answered in a strange language. He thought she was making fun of him. They argued. She cried. He left. They loved each other, but now they couldn't speak. A musician played his flute. He expected others to sing along, as always, but no one followed him, because no one understood the lyrics, because each one was now humming a different tune, a different language, a divided soul. The musician lowered his flute. He looked around and understood. The music had died. The priests rushed to the temple. They lit incense. They raised their hands to the idol. They recited prayers, but they couldn't understand each other. One thought he was praising. The other thought he was being cursed. They began to argue, to push each other, to tear down the altars, and the idol remained silent. And in the midst of all that, mothers searching for their children, running through the streets, shouting names that no longer had an answer. A woman fell to her knees, holding a small shoe. Her voice broke, and her tears fell onto the dust of a city that was no longer home. The nervous animals began to get restless. The donkeys broke their tethers. The camels reared up on two legs. The dogs barked incessantly, because even they knew something had broken. From the top of the tower, Nimrod saw it all. The workers throwing down tools, the men fleeing, the friends fighting, the faces of anguish, the languages shattering like broken glass, and the world fragmented. And as chaos raged below, Nimrod didn't move. Standing there at the top of his unfinished tower, the wind stirred his robes. His golden crown slipped from his forehead, his eyes unblinking. They were fixed on a world crumbling beneath his feet. Where there had once been order, there was now confusion. Where there had been progress, there was now shouting, crying, separation. His men were no longer looking at him. They were no longer listening to him, not because they didn't want to, but because they no longer could. Nimrod knelt on high, not out of humility, but out of weakness. His legs trembled. His pride slipped through his fingers. He tried to speak. He shouted, "Order! Discipline! I am your king." But his words tumbled like stones into the void. No one responded, and if they did, it was in languages he didn't recognize. He descended the tower, step by step, slowly, as if each step weighed an eternity. And when he reached the ground, he was no longer a king. He was just a man. He walked among the remains of the market, the crushed fruit, the torn looms, the knives rusted with tears and blood. He saw his priests fighting among themselves. One was bleeding from his forehead, another had torn off his garments. The incense had gone out. Nimrod looked at them and kept walking. He arrived at the temple, standing in front of the great statue of Marduk, their stone god. He raised his arms. "Answer me," he shouted. "Give me back my empire. Give me the power to unite them again. Make them listen to me. Don't leave me alone." The echo of his voice resounded off the walls, but the idol didn't move. Not a blink, not a breeze. Just silence. A silence that weighed more than 1,000 defeats. And Nimrod fell to his knees. He beat the ground with his fists. He screamed, he cursed, he wept. He threw dust on his head. He tore his royal robe. He tore his throat, crying out. But heaven didn't answer. He spent the entire night there, lying on the floor, trembling, sobbing, lost. Dawn found him dirty, haggard, and devastated. Days later, he wandered around like a beggar. People avoided him. No one spoke his name anymore. And the few who recognized him looked at him with pity, because he who had once been the great hunter before the Lord was now fleeing from his own past. And after the storm of confusion came a moment of stillness. Not peace, but exhaustion. The screams ceased. The violence subsided. The city of Babel lay in ruins, filled with confused, lonely, and broken people. But then, something unexpected began to happen. A man sitting next to a dead oven muttered hopelessly, "Bread. I want bread." And a few steps away, another man, a stranger, raised his head. His eyes widened. He approached. "Did you say bread?" He replied in the same language. The two looked at each other. They understood each other. And in that moment, a spark of hope ignited amidst the ashes. Soon others began to meet, some by chance, others out of necessity. A woman spoke to her daughter, and the girl responded in kind. An old man greeted, and another old man repeated his words in the same cadence. And so the men and women began to gather by language. Small groups, tribes, families united by a language that connected them and separated them from the rest. They held hands. They gathered what little they had, pots, tools, animals, and they began to march into the unknown. Not by choice, but by divine impulse. Some went north, others went down the valleys, some crossed rivers, others climbed mountains. Thus, in days, weeks, perhaps months, humanity dispersed. Those who spoke with loud, rhythmic sounds settled in the southern deserts. There, where the sun embraced the earth, they built mud houses and skin tents. They began to domesticate animals. They began to tell stories around the fire. They formed the first tribe that centuries later would be known as the Arab people. Others, speaking in soft, repetitive tones, followed the course of the great rivers. They skirted fertile hills and planted seeds there. They invented the first symbols to record their trade, and they gave rise to the peoples of Mesopotamia and East Asia. Some sailed across unknown seas. They built rudimentary rafts. The wind carried them beyond what they knew. And their descendants reached distant lands, islands, jungles, mountains, and they founded civilizations hidden from time, the peoples of Oceania, of America, of Africa. Others climbed toward the great northern plains, where the snow was a wall, where the forest was king, where the sky weighed on the earth. And there they carved wood, wove skins, and learned to endure. They gave rise to the peoples who would inhabit Europe, the steppes and the northern valleys. Each group carried with them their words, their songs, their way of describing the world. But they all remembered one place, the Tower. And over time, the memory of Babel became legend. A myth about a lost city where men defied God, and God separated them. And so nations were born, not by conquest, not by politics, but by judgment and purpose. What seemed like a curse became the perfect plan for populating the earth, because even though God confused languages, he never stopped having a plan. And the echo of Babel still lives today, in every accent, in every language, in every origin story, because where pride broke man, God's mercy scattered him to begin anew.